In the marble corridors of imperial Rome, where shadows dance between columns of power and whispers carry the weight of empire, there once walked a boy who would become legend, not for his glory, but for the darkness that consumed him. Here, beneath the 7 hills where gods once walked among mortals, a story unfolds that speaks to the eternal human struggle between destiny and choice, between the crown that elevates and the crown that destroys. Listen now to the wind that still carries echoes through the ruins, to the stones that remember what flesh has forgotten, to the timeless tale of Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, a name that history carved not in gold, but in shadow and flame. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. On the 15th day of December, in the year 37 of the Common Era, as winter's breath touched the hills of Rome and the Tiber flowed dark beneath overcast skies, a child entered the world who would one day set that same city ablaze. The birth took place not in the golden chambers of the Palatine Hill, but in the coastal town of Antium, where the Mediterranean waves whispered against ancient shores and salt air carried omens that no mortal could yet interpret. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, lay in the throes of labour as dawn broke over the empire her family had helped to forge. She was the great-granddaughter of Augustus himself, that first emperor who had transformed Rome from republic to empire, and in her veins flowed the blood of gods and conquerors. Yet as she brought forth her son into the world, the midwives noticed something that would later seem prophetic. The child emerged feet first, a breech birth that ancient Romans considered an omen of misfortune, a sign that fate itself had marked this infant for a destiny written in darkness. The father, Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus, was a man whose very name carried the weight of bronze, Ahenobarbus meaning bronze beard, a family trait that manifested in the ruddy hair that would crown his newborn son. Domitius was known throughout Rome not for his virtues, but for his cruelties. A man who had once deliberately driven his chariot through a crowd in the Roman Forum, killing a child for sport, and who took pleasure in gouging out the eye of a knight who had dared to disagree with him. When friends congratulated him on the birth of his heir, Domitius is said to have replied with chilling prescience, "Nothing produced by me and Agrippina could possibly be good for the state or the people." The child was named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, though history would know him by another name entirely. In those first moments of life, as he drew breath in the coastal air of Antium, none could foresee that this small red-haired infant would become the 5th emperor of Rome, that his name would become synonymous with madness and fire, that bards would sing of his cruelties for centuries to come. He was simply a baby, crying as all babies cry, seeking warmth and comfort in a world that would offer him neither true love nor lasting peace. The Rome into which young Lucius was born was an empire at the height of its power, stretching from the mists of Britain to the sands of Egypt, from the Rhine's cold waters to the Euphrates' distant banks. The Emperor Caligula, Agrippina's own brother, ruled with an increasingly erratic hand, his sanity slowly unraveling under the weight of absolute power. The Praetorian Guard watched nervously as their emperor declared himself a god, married his sister, and spoke to statues as if they were living beings. In the streets of Rome, citizens whispered of omens and portents, of sacrifices that went wrong, and auguries that spoke of coming doom. Agrippina, holding her newborn son in those first precious hours, could not have known that she cradled in her arms both her greatest achievement and her ultimate destroyer. She was a woman of fierce ambition, inheriting from her Julio-Claudian bloodline not only noble features and imperial bearing, but an insatiable hunger for power that would drive her to extraordinary lengths. Her own mother had been the beloved granddaughter of Augustus, and Agrippina had been raised with the absolute certainty that imperial blood made her superior to all other mortals save those who shared her divine lineage. The infant's early months were spent in the villa at Antium, where the sound of waves provided a constant backdrop to his first experiences of the world. Wet nurses tended to his needs, while Agrippina planned her return to Rome and the political machinations that would elevate her position at court. Even in those peaceful early days, visitors to the villa remarked on the child's unusual appearance. His hair was not quite red, not quite gold, but some unique shade between the two that caught light like burnished copper. His eyes, when they opened, held an intensity that seemed almost unsettling in one so young. As winter gave way to spring and spring to summer, the political landscape of Rome shifted like sand dunes in a desert wind. Caligula's madness deepened, and with it grew the certainty among the senatorial class and the Praetorian Guard that something would have to be done. Agrippina, still nursing her infant son, began to position herself carefully for whatever upheaval might come. She understood that in the dangerous game of imperial succession, preparation was everything, and she was determined that her son would not be merely a bystander to history, but an active participant in shaping it. The child's first smile, when it came, was noted by those around him, not for its innocence, but for something else, a quality that seemed almost calculating, as if even in infancy he possessed an awareness of the power that surrounded him. Slaves in the household whispered among themselves about the young master's penetrating gaze, how he seemed to study faces with an intensity beyond his months, how he rarely cried, but instead observed the world around him with an almost disturbing stillness. By the time young Lucius reached his 3rd year, the world had transformed around him with the sudden violence that characterized imperial Rome. In January of the year 41, his uncle Caligula fell to assassins' blades in the underground passages of the Palatine Hill, his brief reign of terror ending in a pool of blood beneath the Roman Forum. The Praetorian Guard, having disposed of one emperor, immediately elevated another. Claudius, Caligula's stammering scholarly uncle, who had survived the dangerous decades of imperial intrigue by appearing too weak and too foolish to pose a threat to anyone. Agrippina watched these developments with the keen eye of a strategist planning a campaign. Claudius's elevation meant opportunity, for he was her uncle, and more importantly, he was a man who could be influenced, manipulated, and perhaps even controlled by someone with sufficient cunning and determination. She began immediately to position herself within the new emperor's court, bringing young Lucius with her to the Palatine Hill, where the child's earliest coherent memories would be formed among the marble statues of deified emperors and the echoing chambers where the fate of the world was decided. The boy adapted to palace life with an ease that both impressed and unsettled those around him. While other children might have been overwhelmed by the grandeur and formality of the imperial court, Lucius seemed to absorb it all like a sponge, learning to navigate the complex hierarchies and unspoken rules that governed life among the powerful. He watched with bright eyes as senators prostrated themselves before his granduncle Claudius, as freedmen whispered urgent messages in shadowed alcoves, as his mother held whispered conversations with influential courtiers who could advance her position. Agrippina's beauty was legendary throughout Rome, but her intelligence was even more formidable. She understood that in order to secure her son's future, she would need to become indispensable to Claudius himself. The emperor, despite his physical infirmities and scholarly temperament, was no fool. He had survived the reigns of Caligula and Tiberius by keeping his head down and his ambitions hidden. But he was also a man susceptible to feminine influence, particularly from women who could combine beauty with the noble bloodline that legitimized imperial power. As Lucius grew from toddler to child, he became an unwitting instrument in his mother's carefully orchestrated campaign to secure her position. Agrippina would bring him to court functions, dressed in miniature togas that emphasized his imperial lineage, his copper-colored hair carefully styled to catch the light streaming through the palace windows. The boy learned to bow at precisely the right moment, to remain silent when adults spoke, to present himself as the perfect embodiment of noble Roman virtue, even as his mother schooled him in the more subtle arts of palace intrigue. Claudius, childless by his current marriage to Messalina, began to take notice of his great-nephew. The emperor was a man who valued learning above all else, and he was impressed by the boy's quick wit and apparent eagerness to absorb knowledge. During family gatherings, Lucius would sit quietly at his granduncle's feet, listening with apparent fascination as Claudius spoke of Roman history, of the great campaigns that had built the empire, of the legal reforms that had codified Roman justice. The emperor, starved for intellectual companionship in a court dominated by political maneuvering, began to see in his young relative a kindred spirit. But Agrippina's ambitions extended far beyond simply gaining Claudius's affection for her son. She watched with growing alarm as the emperor's wife, Messalina, consolidated her own power and began to present herself as a potential rival for influence over imperial policy. Messalina was young, beautiful, and utterly without moral restraint. She had taken multiple lovers while married to the emperor, and her excesses had become legendary throughout Rome. More dangerously from Agrippina's perspective, Messalina had begun to position her own son, Britannicus, as Claudius's heir apparent. The tension between the two women played out in the shadowed corridors of the palace, a cold war fought with subtle glances, carefully chosen words, and strategic alliances. Lucius, now old enough to understand that something significant was at stake, watched his mother navigate these treacherous waters with increasing sophistication. He learned to read the subtle signs of palace intrigue, which freedmen carried real influence, which senators could be trusted, which courtiers were merely ornamental figures with no actual power. Agrippina's breakthrough came when Messalina's recklessness finally exceeded even Claudius's considerable tolerance. The emperor's wife had gone through a marriage ceremony with one of her lovers, while Claudius was away from Rome, an act of such breathtaking audacity that even her supporters were stunned into silence. When word reached Claudius, his fury was terrible to behold. The scholarly emperor, who preferred books to bloodshed, ordered the immediate execution of his wife and her paramour, clearing the way for Agrippina to make her move. Young Lucius was present in the palace when news arrived of Messalina's death. He watched his mother's face carefully, seeing not grief or shock, but a kind of cold satisfaction that spoke to calculations completed and obstacles removed. That night, as the palace settled into an uneasy quiet, Agrippina came to her son's chambers and sat beside his bed in the darkness. She spoke to him in whispers about destiny and preparation, about the weight of imperial blood and the responsibilities it entailed. Though he was still a child, Lucius understood that his life had reached a turning point, that the game his mother had been playing was about to enter a new and more dangerous phase. The marriage of Claudius and Agrippina in the year 49 marked a fundamental transformation in young Lucius's world. At 12 years old, he was no longer simply the son of an ambitious noblewoman, but the stepson of the emperor himself, elevated overnight to a position that placed him among the most powerful children in the known world. The wedding ceremony, conducted with all the pomp and circumstance befitting an imperial union, took place in the great hall of the palace, where senators and foreign dignitaries gathered to witness what many privately considered a dangerous consolidation of power within the Julio-Claudian bloodline. Agrippina's triumph was complete, but it came with prices that would only become apparent in the years to come. She had maneuvered herself into the position of empress, but in doing so, she had also placed herself and her son in the direct line of sight of every ambitious politician, every jealous courtier, every potential rival who saw their elevation as a threat to their own positions. The palace, always a place of whispered conversations and hidden daggers, became even more treacherous as various factions began to coalesce around different visions of the imperial succession. For Lucius, now installed in quarters befitting his new status as the emperor's stepson, life took on a rhythm of formal education, court ceremonies, and careful observation of the adult world that surrounded him. His tutors were the finest scholars money could procure, men versed in rhetoric, philosophy, mathematics, and the military arts that every Roman nobleman was expected to master. Yet alongside these conventional subjects, the boy received a different kind of education in the informal lessons he absorbed simply by living in the heart of the Roman government. He learned to recognize the subtle differences in how various courtiers approached his stepfather Claudius, the obsequious flattery of those seeking favors, the careful neutrality of those who served the state rather than the man, the barely concealed contempt of senators who remembered the Republic and resented the entire imperial system. He watched as his mother held her own court within the palace, receiving visitors who came to seek her influence with the emperor, dispensing favors and storing up obligations that could be called upon when needed. Claudius, for his part, seemed genuinely fond of his young stepson, perhaps seeing in Lucius some reflection of his own scholarly interests. The emperor would often summon the boy to his private study, where scrolls and tablets covered every available surface, and the air was thick with the scent of ink and parchment. In these quiet moments, away from the formalities of court life, Claudius would share his passion for history, recounting tales of the great Roman conquests, the wisdom of ancient lawgivers, the engineering marvels that had transformed a small Italian city into the master of the Mediterranean world. These conversations left a lasting impression on Lucius, but perhaps not the one Claudius intended. While the emperor spoke of duty, service, and the weight of responsibility that came with power, the boy heard something else: the loneliness of absolute authority, the isolation that separated the ruler from all other human beings, the terrible burden of making decisions that affected millions of lives. He began to understand that the emperor, for all his power, was in many ways the most trapped person in the empire, surrounded by people who wanted something from him, but unable to trust any of them completely. As Lucius approached his 13th birthday, Agrippina began to implement the next phase of her long-term strategy. She convinced Claudius to formally adopt her son, a move that would place him directly in line for the imperial succession, ahead of Claudius's biological son, Britannicus. The adoption ceremony was a grand affair, conducted according to ancient Roman law and witnessed by the entire Senate. On that day, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus ceased to exist, and in his place stood Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, heir apparent to the Roman Empire. The name change was more than symbolic. It represented a complete transformation of identity and destiny. The boy who had been born in obscurity by the sea was now officially a Caesar, carrying a name that had become synonymous with absolute power throughout the known world. Yet with this elevation came new pressures and expectations that would have tested the wisdom of a man twice his age. Nero, as he was now known, found himself the center of attention from courtiers who sought to curry favor with the future emperor, from teachers who competed to be known as the instructor of Caesar's heir, from foreign dignitaries who wanted to study the character of the man who might one day rule their homelands. The relationship between Nero and his stepbrother Britannicus became increasingly strained as the implications of the adoption became clear. Britannicus, though younger, was Claudius's biological son and had until recently been the presumptive heir to the throne. Now he found himself displaced by his older stepbrother, relegated to a secondary position that must have seemed both unfair and politically dangerous. The two boys, thrown together by their parents' ambitions, developed a rivalry that was carefully masked in public, but increasingly obvious to those who knew how to read the subtle signs of palace intrigue. Nero's education expanded to include subjects deemed essential for a future emperor: military strategy, provincial administration, the complex legal frameworks that held the empire together, and the delicate art of managing the Roman Senate. His rhetoric teacher, the philosopher Seneca, was brought in specifically to polish the young heir's speaking abilities and to provide him with the philosophical grounding that Romans believed essential for effective leadership. Seneca, a man of considerable learning and political experience, would become one of the most important influences on Nero's intellectual development, though whether that influence was ultimately positive or negative remains one of history's great questions. Under Seneca's tutelage, Nero developed an appreciation for Greek culture and philosophy that would remain with him throughout his life. He learned to speak Greek fluently, to appreciate the subtleties of classical literature, and to see himself as part of a broader Mediterranean civilization that extended far beyond the borders of Italy. This cosmopolitan outlook would later influence his imperial policies, leading him to spend vast sums on Greek-style entertainments and to dream of conquering the East in emulation of Alexander the Great. Yet even as Nero absorbed these refined influences, he also witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of imperial power. He was present in the palace when suspected conspirators were brought before Claudius for judgment, watching as men who had once been his stepfather's friends and advisers pleaded for their lives before being led away to execution. He observed the careful dance between the emperor and the Praetorian Guard, understanding instinctively that real power in Rome rested ultimately on the loyalty of armed men, rather than the abstract legitimacy of law or tradition. As Nero entered his 15th year, the subtle machinations that had surrounded his childhood began to crystallize into concrete preparations for imperial succession. Agrippina, now secure in her position as empress, but ever mindful of the precarious nature of palace politics, intensified her efforts to ensure that her son would not merely inherit the throne, but be prepared to hold it against all challengers. She understood, perhaps better than Claudius himself, that the transition from one emperor to another was always the most dangerous moment in the life of the empire, a time when ambitious generals, desperate senators, and rival claimants could tear apart the carefully constructed facade of imperial stability. The empress began to surround Nero with her own network of loyal supporters, men whose fortunes were tied so closely to the young heir's success that they would have no choice but to support him when the crucial moment arrived. She cultivated relationships with key figures in the Praetorian Guard, understanding that in the final analysis, the support of Rome's elite military unit would be more valuable than all the senatorial decrees and popular acclamation in the world. Through careful distribution of gifts, promises of future advancement, and the implicit threat of what might happen to those who opposed her, she gradually built a power base that extended throughout the various levels of Roman government. Nero himself was not merely a passive beneficiary of his mother's political maneuvering. Under her careful guidance, he began to learn the practical arts of leadership and manipulation that no formal education could provide. He accompanied Claudius to meetings with provincial governors, observing how the emperor balanced competing interests and managed the complex web of relationships that held the empire together. He sat in on Senate sessions, watching as the remnants of Republican tradition wrestled with the realities of imperial power, learning to recognize which senators were genuine supporters of the imperial system and which were merely going through the motions of loyalty while harboring deeper reservations. Perhaps, most importantly, Nero began to develop his own understanding of the Roman people and what they wanted from their rulers. He attended public games and festivals, carefully studying the crowd's reactions to different types of entertainment, noting how their mood could shift from approval to hostility and back again based on factors that often seemed to have little to do with actual policy or governance. He learned that the Roman populace, for all their famous discipline and order, were fundamentally an emotional people who responded more to spectacle and gesture than to rational argument or careful administration. This insight would prove crucial to his later reign, as Nero developed an intuitive understanding of how to manipulate public opinion through grand gestures, lavish entertainments, and appeals to the Romans' sense of their own specialness and superiority. He saw how Claudius, despite his genuine accomplishments as an administrator and legal reformer, often struggled to connect with ordinary citizens because he approached them as a scholar rather than as a showman. The young heir began to form his own ideas about how an emperor should present himself to his subjects, ideas that would later manifest in ways that shock the traditional Roman elite. As Nero's political education progressed, his personal relationships within the imperial family became increasingly complex and potentially dangerous. His stepbrother Britannicus, now approaching his own coming of age, represented a constant reminder that Nero's position as heir was not unassailable. Though Claudius had formally adopted Nero and named him as successor, there were always those who argued that blood ties should take precedence over legal arrangements, and Britannicus's supporters quietly maintained that the biological son of the emperor had a stronger claim to the throne than an adopted stepson. The tension between the two young men was carefully managed by both Agrippina and Claudius, neither of whom wanted open conflict within the imperial family to provide opportunities for outside forces to exploit. Yet beneath the surface, politeness and formal fraternal affection, both Nero and Britannicus understood that their relationship was fundamentally competitive, and that only one of them could ultimately inherit their father's position. This knowledge colored every interaction between them, turning even casual conversations into subtle contests for dominance and carefully watched displays of imperial potential. Nero's marriage to Octavia, Claudius's daughter and Britannicus's sister, was arranged during this period as part of Agrippina's broader strategy to cement her son's position within the imperial family. The wedding, celebrated with appropriate ceremony and public festivities, served multiple political purposes. It bound Nero more closely to Claudius's direct bloodline. It provided him with a wife whose impeccable lineage would enhance his own legitimacy, and it created family ties that would make it more difficult for Britannicus to challenge his stepbrother's succession without appearing to attack his own sister's position. Yet the marriage also introduced new complications into Nero's life, as he now had to navigate not only the political implications of his relationship with Claudius's daughter, but also the personal and emotional dimensions of a union that had been arranged for reasons of state rather than affection. Octavia was a young woman of considerable beauty and intelligence, raised in the same palatial environment that had shaped Nero's own character, but their relationship would always be overshadowed by the political calculations that had brought them together. As the year 54 dawned, signs began to appear that Claudius's health was declining and that the long-anticipated succession crisis might be approaching more rapidly than anyone had expected. The emperor, now in his 64th year, had never been physically robust, and the strains of governing an empire that stretched across 3 continents were beginning to show in his increasingly frequent illnesses and his growing reliance on others to handle the day-to-day administration of imperial business. Agrippina watched these developments with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety, knowing that her son's future would be determined by how successfully she could manage the transition when it finally came. Nero himself seemed to understand that his childhood was drawing to a close and that the responsibilities of imperial power were approaching with inexorable certainty. Those who observed him during this period noted a change in his demeanor, a new seriousness that replaced some of the youthful exuberance that had characterized his earlier years, a more calculating approach to his relationships and public appearances, and an increased interest in the practical details of government that suggested he was beginning to see himself not merely as the heir to the throne, but as its future occupant. The education that had once focused primarily on classical literature and philosophical discourse now expanded to include intensive training in military command, detailed study of provincial administration, and careful analysis of the economic foundations that supported the imperial system. Nero's tutors, led by the philosopher Seneca, worked to provide him with the intellectual framework he would need to govern effectively, while Agrippina ensured that he also received more practical instruction in the arts of political manipulation and the management of the various factions that competed for influence within the imperial court. Yet even as Nero prepared for the responsibilities that awaited him, there were already signs of the character traits that would later define his reign in ways that his mother and tutors never anticipated. He showed an intense interest in artistic pursuits that went beyond what was considered appropriate for a future emperor, spending long hours practicing music and poetry when he might have been studying military tactics or legal precedents. He displayed a love of spectacle and public performance that worried some of his advisors, who feared that such interests were beneath the dignity of imperial office. Most troubling of all, he occasionally showed flashes of cruelty and caprice that suggested the potential for the kind of arbitrary rule that had characterized the worst of his predecessors. As autumn arrived and the Roman political season resumed, after the summer recess, events began to move with a momentum that would soon sweep away the careful plans and long-term strategies that had dominated palace life for so many years. Claudius's health took a decisive turn for the worse, and it became clear to all who were close to the imperial family that the succession question would soon be resolved, one way or another. In the shadows of the Palatine Hill, where the footsteps of emperors had echoed for generations, a new chapter in the story of Roman power was about to begin, with consequences that would reshape not only the empire, but the entire course of Mediterranean civilization. The golden doors of the Domus Transitoria swung open to reveal a figure who would reshape the very foundations of imperial Rome. As the morning light filtered through marble columns, Nero Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, stepped forward into destiny itself, his youth betraying nothing of the storms that would follow in his wake. In the year 54 of the Common Era, when autumn leaves fell like scattered coins across the 7 hills, Rome received its youngest emperor. At merely 16 years of age, Nero ascended to the throne through a web of political maneuvering that would have challenged men twice his years. Yet there he stood, draped in purple that seemed almost too heavy for his slender shoulders, while the Senate spoke words of loyalty that echoed through chambers where his predecessors had once walked. The boy who had once recited poetry beneath olive trees now held the fate of an empire spanning from the mists of Britain to the sands of Egypt. His mother, Agrippina, watched from the shadows of the palace corridors, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of ambition fulfilled. She had orchestrated this moment with the precision of a master musician. Each note of conspiracy played to perfection until her son sat upon the throne that had once seemed impossibly distant. But even as the crowds cheered in the Forum Romanum, their voices carrying hopes for a new golden age, the seeds of future tragedy lay dormant beneath the marble floors of the palace. The same hands that would one day be stained with blood now accepted the ring of Augustus, while senators who would later flee in terror offered their congratulations with smiles that masked their uncertainty. Seneca, the philosopher who had guided Nero's education since childhood, stood beside his former pupil with a mixture of pride and apprehension. The Stoic teachings that had shaped the young prince's mind seemed fragile when measured against the intoxicating power of absolute rule. Yet in those early days, hope remained stronger than fear, and even the wisest among Rome's elite believed that wisdom might yet triumph over the corruption that had claimed so many before. The first proclamations of Nero's reign rang with promises that would have made Marcus Aurelius himself nod in approval. Justice would flow like a clear stream through the empire's courts. The Senate would regain its dignity, no longer cowering before imperial whim. Taxes would be reduced, and the people would know prosperity as their fathers had known in the days of Augustus. These were not merely the words of a young ruler seeking approval. They seemed to emerge from genuine conviction, as if the boy emperor truly believed he could succeed where others had failed. In the villa of Seneca, where cypress trees whispered secrets to the wind, the old philosopher penned letters to friends in distant provinces. His words carried cautious optimism, describing a student whose mind remained sharp despite the golden chains of power that now bound him. Yet even then, in the quiet moments between public ceremonies, Seneca noticed subtle changes in his protégé. A hardening around the eyes, a quickness to anger when crossed, a growing impatience with the measured pace of republican tradition. The palace itself seemed to transform around its new occupant, as if the very stones sensed the shift in imperial temperament. Where Claudius had shuffled through corridors with scholarly distraction, Nero strode with the confidence of youth unchastened by failure. Servants who had learned to anticipate the stammering requests of the previous emperor now found themselves adjusting to commands delivered with theatrical flourish. Burrus, the steady Praetorian prefect whose loyalty had helped secure Nero's ascension, watched these early transformations with the eye of a soldier who had seen many battles. He understood that the transition from private citizen to emperor was like crossing a river from which there could be no return. The young man who emerged on the far shore might bear the same name and face, but the soul would be forever changed by the crossing. In the markets of Rome, merchants spoke in hushed tones about the new emperor's generosity. Golden coins flowed from the imperial treasury like water from mountain springs, funding games and spectacles that delighted the masses. The people, who had grown weary of Claudius's scholarly reclusiveness, welcomed a ruler who seemed to understand their hunger for entertainment and display. Yet the more perceptive among them noticed that such generosity, however welcome, carried its own dangers when practiced without restraint. As winter settled over the capital, Nero established patterns that would define his early reign. Mornings were spent in council with Seneca and Burrus, where matters of state received careful consideration. The young emperor displayed a quick intelligence that impressed even hardened veterans of imperial politics. His questions were sharp, his grasp of complex issues remarkable for one so young. It seemed that the careful education provided by Rome's finest minds had indeed produced a ruler capable of wisdom. Yet afternoons told a different story, one that would grow in significance as the months passed. Nero's passion for the arts, which had once been viewed as a charming hobby suitable for a prince, now began to consume hours that previous emperors had devoted to administrative duties. In private chambers decorated with masks of comedy and tragedy, the emperor practiced his singing voice and rehearsed dramatic performances that no courtier dared to criticize. The sound of the lyre echoed through corridors where once only the scratch of reed pens and the murmur of serious conversation had been heard. Freedmen who had served Claudius with quiet efficiency now found themselves listening to musical compositions that their new master insisted on sharing with anyone within earshot. Some recognized genuine talent in these performances. Others merely nodded with the wisdom of those who understood that imperial art, whatever its quality, demanded appreciation. In the gardens of the palace where laurel trees provided shade for contemplation, Seneca and his young charge walked together as they had in years past. But the dynamic between teacher and student had shifted imperceptibly, like shadows moving across sundials as the day progressed. Nero still sought his advisor's counsel, still listened with apparent respect to lessons drawn from Stoic philosophy, yet something fundamental had changed in the space between question and answer. The philosopher found himself choosing his words with greater care, weighing each piece of advice against the uncertain temperament of absolute power. Where once he had spoken freely of virtue and restraint, now he detected a restlessness in his pupil's eyes when such topics arose. The young emperor seemed increasingly drawn to discussions of glory and artistic achievement, subjects that lay somewhat beyond the traditional scope of philosophical instruction. During one such conversation, as evening painted the sky in shades of imperial purple, Nero posed a question that would linger in Seneca's memory like an unwelcome prophecy. "Master," the emperor had said, his voice carrying a note of challenge barely concealed beneath respectful inquiry, "is it not possible that the highest virtue might sometimes require actions that appear harsh to those who lack understanding?" The question hung in the air between them like incense, sweet on the surface but leaving a bitter aftertaste. Seneca's response, carefully crafted to guide without appearing to lecture, seemed to satisfy the young ruler. Yet the philosopher detected something troubling in the ease with which Nero accepted his explanation. It was as if the emperor were collecting justifications rather than seeking truth, gathering philosophical ammunition for battles not yet fought, but already anticipated in the depths of an increasingly complex mind. The influence of Agrippina, meanwhile, continued to cast its shadow over the imperial household. The emperor's mother had not retired gracefully to the background after securing her son's elevation. Instead, she maintained her grip on power with the tenacity of one who had sacrificed too much to surrender her position without a fight. Her presence in council meetings became a source of tension that even the most diplomatic courtiers could not entirely ignore. Mother and son now engaged in a delicate dance of wills, each seeking to maintain influence over the direction of the empire. Agrippina's experience in the treacherous waters of imperial politics clashed with Nero's growing desire for independence, creating currents of conflict that threatened to drag the entire court into dangerous depths. Their conversations, once marked by maternal guidance and filial respect, now carried undertones of suspicion and barely concealed resentment. The Senate, observing these familial tensions with the practiced eye of survivors, chose caution over boldness in their dealings with the imperial household. Senators who had learned to navigate the paranoid waters of previous reigns now found themselves studying a new dynamic, trying to understand which faction would ultimately prevail in the struggle for influence over the young emperor's decisions. In the provinces, governors who had grown comfortable with the predictable patterns of Claudius's rule began to adjust their expectations to accommodate a new imperial personality. Reports from the capital spoke of a ruler who displayed both promise and uncertainty. A young man whose potential for greatness seemed matched only by his capacity for surprising those who thought they understood him. The army, that ultimate arbiter of imperial destiny, watched these early developments with the pragmatic patience of professional soldiers. Veterans who had served under multiple emperors understood that the true measure of a ruler emerged not in the honeyed words of early proclamations, but in the hard choices that crisis inevitably demanded. They would wait, as soldiers always waited, to see what manner of man their new commander would prove to be when tested by the fires of genuine adversity. As spring returned to Rome, bringing with it the renewal that marked each turning of the seasons, Nero's reign began to establish its own distinctive character. The young emperor's morning councils with Seneca and Burrus continued to address matters of governance with apparent seriousness, yet the emperor's attention seemed increasingly divided between administrative duties and artistic pursuits that consumed more of his time and energy with each passing week. The question of succession, always present in the minds of those who surrounded the throne, took on particular urgency given Nero's youth and apparent reluctance to marry. Courtiers who had learned to think in terms of dynasties and bloodlines found themselves uncertain about the future direction of imperial policy. The emperor's romantic inclinations, still developing in the manner of any young man, became matters of state interest that few dared to address directly. In the libraries of Rome, where scholars preserved the wisdom of ages past, learned men began to compile accounts of Nero's early reign that would form the foundation of historical judgment. Yet even these careful observers struggled to discern the true character of their subject, finding in the young emperor's actions a complexity that defied simple categorization. Was he the wise pupil of Seneca, guided by philosophical principle, toward just rule? Or was he something else entirely, a figure whose true nature remained hidden beneath the pleasing facade of youth and cultural refinement? The second year of Nero's reign unfolded like a scroll upon which history itself seemed uncertain what words to write. In the Forum Romanum, where citizens gathered to discuss the affairs of empire, conversations carried a note of cautious optimism, tempered by the wisdom of those who had witnessed the rise and fall of many rulers. The young emperor had yet to disappoint their hopes, yet neither had he provided the clear signs of greatness that would allow them to rest easily in their beds. Within the palace walls, the daily rhythms of imperial life began to reflect the growing complexity of Nero's character. Morning audiences with foreign ambassadors displayed the emperor's quick intelligence and genuine interest in the welfare of distant provinces. His questions revealed a mind capable of grasping the interconnected nature of imperial administration, and his responses suggested a ruler who understood the delicate balance required to maintain peace across such vast territories. Yet these same chambers that witnessed displays of imperial wisdom also echoed with sounds that would have puzzled previous generations of Roman leaders. The emperor's afternoons increasingly belonged to his artistic passions, and the palace resounded with music that ranged from traditional Roman melodies to exotic compositions inspired by Greek theatrical traditions. Courtiers learned to navigate conversations that might shift without warning from discussions of tax policy to detailed critiques of dramatic performance. Seneca observed these developments with the mixed feelings of a teacher watching a promising student venture into territory beyond the reach of instruction. The philosophical principles that had guided Nero's education remained visible in his approach to governance, yet they seemed increasingly overshadowed by impulses that drew their inspiration from sources the old Stoic found less reliable. Art and emotion, while possessing their own validity, made uncertain foundations for the kind of measured judgment that imperial rule demanded. The relationship between Nero and his mother continued to evolve in ways that created ripples throughout the imperial court. Agrippina's attempts to maintain her influence met with growing resistance from a son who had begun to taste the intoxicating freedom of absolute power. Their disagreements, initially conducted behind closed doors with the discretion appropriate to family matters, began to spill over into public forums where their effects could not be contained. Burrus, the practical soldier whose loyalty had helped secure Nero's position, found himself increasingly called upon to mediate between competing factions within the imperial household. His military background had prepared him for many challenges, but the delicate task of managing the emotional dynamics of a family that happened to rule the world required skills that no amount of battlefield experience could provide. The Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers whose swords ultimately determined the fate of emperors, watched these developments with the alert attention of men whose lives depended on their ability to read the shifting currents of palace politics. They had sworn loyalty to Nero, but they understood better than most that such oaths carried weight only as long as the emperor retained the strength and wisdom to honor his part of the compact between ruler and ruled. In the provinces, where distance provided some insulation from the immediate pressures of court life, governors began to notice subtle changes in the tone of imperial communications. Directives that had once reflected the measured deliberation of careful consultation now occasionally bore traces of a more impulsive decision-making process. Nothing dramatic enough to cause immediate concern, but sufficient to suggest that the young emperor's character continued to evolve in ways that might eventually demand adjustment from those charged with implementing his will. The Senate, that ancient institution whose dignity had survived countless imperial transformations, attempted to maintain its traditional role while adapting to the particular requirements of governing under a ruler whose personality defied easy prediction. Senators who had mastered the art of offering counsel that appeared wise while avoiding the dangerous territory of unwelcome advice found themselves recalibrating their approach to accommodate Nero's unique combination of intellectual ability and emotional volatility. Among the people of Rome, whose daily lives provided the ultimate foundation for imperial stability, opinions about their young emperor remained largely favorable. His generosity with public entertainments and his apparent concern for their welfare had earned him a reservoir of goodwill that more experienced rulers might have envied. Yet even among the masses, perceptive individuals began to notice changes in the quality of imperial attention that suggested potential complications ahead. The emperor's growing passion for performance created opportunities for public display that previous rulers had rarely embraced. When Nero appeared before crowds to demonstrate his musical abilities, the response was invariably enthusiastic, though careful observers might have questioned whether such enthusiasm was entirely spontaneous. The sight of an emperor seeking applause for artistic achievement rather than military victory represented a departure from Roman tradition that some found refreshing, while others viewed with quiet unease. As the seasons turned and Nero's reign moved through its third year, the patterns that would define his rule became increasingly apparent to those with eyes to see. The young emperor remained capable of brilliant insights and generous impulses. Yet these positive qualities seemed increasingly balanced by tendencies that gave pause to thoughtful observers. The question that hung unspoken in the air of council, chambers and private gatherings was whether the promise of his early reign would ultimately be fulfilled or would give way to something less worthy of the hopes that had welcomed his ascension. In the shadows of the palace corridors, where servants and freedmen observed the daily drama of imperial life without the luxury of maintaining illusions, whispered conversations began to carry notes of concern that had been absent during Nero's first months as emperor. These humble observers, whose survival depended on their ability to anticipate the moods and reactions of their superiors, possessed an instinctive understanding of character that sometimes proved more accurate than the elaborate analyses of learned philosophers. The transformation they witnessed was subtle, but unmistakable, a gradual hardening of sensitivity into callousness, a slow erosion of the youthful idealism that had once seemed to promise a return to the golden age of Augustus. Like water wearing away stone, the constant pressure of absolute power was reshaping the young emperor's character in ways that would eventually become apparent to all who encountered him. The year 57 brought with it changes that seemed to shift the very foundations upon which the early promise of Nero's reign had been built. In the gardens of the Palatine Hill, where emperors had walked for generations, the young ruler now paced with a restlessness that spoke of inner conflicts too, complex for easy resolution. The olive trees that had witnessed the contemplative strolls of Augustus now provided shade for a figure whose thoughts moved in directions that would have surprised his illustrious predecessor. Agrippina's influence, once so carefully orchestrated and seemingly unassailable, began to encounter resistance that grew stronger with each passing month. The emperor, who had once sought his mother's counsel on matters great and small, now displayed an independence that bordered on defiance. Their conversations, previously characterized by the mutual respect appropriate to a relationship between devoted parent and grateful child, took on the brittle quality of negotiations between rival powers. The palace servants, those invisible witnesses to imperial intimacy, noted the growing tension with the survival instincts of those whose lives depended on their ability to navigate the dangerous currents of dynastic conflict. Doors that had once stood open between the emperor's chambers and his mother's apartments now remained closed for hours at a time. Meals that had provided opportunities for family consultation were increasingly taken in solitude, or with companions chosen for their entertainment value rather than their political wisdom. Seneca, watching these developments with the growing concern of a teacher who sensed his pupil slipping beyond the reach of instruction, attempted to provide guidance that might restore the balance he had worked so carefully to establish. Yet his philosophical counsel, once received with apparent gratitude and understanding, now seemed to fall upon ears increasingly attuned to different voices. The emperor's responses to Stoic wisdom carried a perfunctory quality that suggested polite endurance rather than genuine engagement. The change was most apparent in Nero's artistic pursuits, which had evolved from pleasant diversions into consuming passions that demanded increasing amounts of imperial time and attention. The emperor's voice, trained now by the finest instructors available in the empire, had indeed improved beyond the level of mere amateur enthusiasm. Yet the hours devoted to musical practice came at the expense of administrative duties that previous rulers had considered the essential foundation of imperial responsibility. In the council chambers, where matters of state received their daily consideration, Burrus found himself increasingly required to make decisions that would once have awaited the emperor's personal attention. The Praetorian prefect, whose soldier's sense of duty had never wavered, accepted these additional responsibilities with the stoic determination of a man who understood that empires required governing regardless of their rulers' momentary inclinations. Yet, even Burrus, whose loyalty to the imperial institution transcended his personal feelings about any individual emperor, began to recognize patterns that suggested potential challenges ahead. The young ruler's decisions, when he chose to make them, displayed the same intelligence that had marked his early reign, but they came now with less frequency and often reflected considerations that seemed to prioritize personal satisfaction over broader imperial interests. The Senate, that ancient body whose survival instincts had been honed by centuries of adaptation to imperial whim, began to adjust their expectations accordingly. Senators learned to present their proposals at times when the emperor's attention was most likely to be focused on governmental rather than artistic matters. They developed an informal understanding of which issues could be resolved without imperial input, and which required the kind of careful presentation that might capture and hold Nero's increasingly selective interest. In the provinces, where the effects of imperial policy ultimately determined the success or failure of Roman rule, governors began to notice subtle changes in the quality of communication from the capital. Instructions that arrived from Rome reflected the same general intelligence and concern for provincial welfare that had characterized Nero's early reign. Yet they seemed increasingly influenced by advisors whose names were less familiar and whose qualifications for offering guidance on matters of imperial administration were sometimes unclear. The emperor's personal relationships also began to reflect the broader changes in his character and priorities. Companions who had once been chosen for their wisdom and virtue found themselves replaced by individuals whose primary qualifications seemed to be their ability to appreciate and encourage Nero's artistic endeavors. The imperial court, once dominated by the serious business of governing an empire, took on an increasingly theatrical quality that some found refreshing while others viewed with growing alarm. Among these new companions, none proved more influential than Poppaea Sabina, whose beauty and intelligence had captured the young emperor's attention in ways that promised to reshape the very foundations of his personal life. Her presence in the palace represented more than a simple romantic attachment. It symbolized Nero's growing willingness to prioritize personal desires over the traditional constraints that had guided imperial behavior for generations. The relationship between Nero and Poppaea developed with an intensity that seemed to eclipse all other considerations. Their conversations, conducted in chambers decorated with silk and precious stones, explored topics that ranged far beyond the conventional boundaries of imperial romance. She possessed the rare combination of physical attraction and intellectual sophistication that could hold the attention of a ruler whose interests had grown increasingly complex and demanding. Yet Poppaea's influence extended beyond the realm. of personal affection into areas that touched upon matters of state. Her opinions on imperial policy, delivered with the confidence of one who understood her power to shape the emperor's thinking, began to compete with the counsel offered by more traditional advisors. The competition between established wisdom and personal preference created tensions that reverberated throughout the imperial hierarchy. Agrippina, recognizing the threat that this new relationship posed to her own influence, attempted to reassert her maternal authority through methods that had proven effective in the past. Yet the emperor, who had once yielded to such pressure, now met it with a resistance that suggested fundamental changes in the balance of power within the imperial family. The struggle between mother and son took on characteristics that went beyond simple generational conflict to encompass broader questions about the nature and limits of imperial authority itself. As the year progressed toward its conclusion, those with the wisdom to read the signs began to understand that they were witnessing not merely the normal evolution of a young ruler's character, but something more profound and potentially more dangerous. The transformation of Nero from promising young emperor to something else entirely was proceeding with a momentum that seemed to resist the kind of guidance and constraint that had shaped his early reign. In the quiet moments before dawn, when the palace lay shrouded in the darkness that precedes the daily renewal of imperial ceremony, thoughtful observers might have wondered whether the changes they witnessed represented natural development or the first visible signs of a deterioration that would eventually consume everything they had hoped to preserve. The answer to that question lay hidden in the depths of an imperial character that had grown increasingly complex and increasingly difficult to predict. The foundations of Nero's reign, once seemingly solid as the stones of the Palatine itself, had begun to shift in ways that would ultimately determine not only the fate of an emperor, but the destiny of an empire that had placed its trust in the wisdom and virtue of a ruler whose true nature remained a mystery, even to those who knew him best. The young emperor's hands moved across the strings of his lyre with the delicate precision of one who believed himself touched by Apollo himself. In the marble corridors of the Palatine, where the voices of senators once echoed with gravitas and purpose, now drifted the haunting melodies of a ruler who sought to remake not just Rome, but the very nature of imperial power itself. Nero's transformation from dutiful student to artistic sovereign began not with grand proclamations, but with whispered conversations in the shadowed alcoves of the palace. The emperor, who had once sat quietly through Senate meetings, now found himself drawn to the company of musicians, poets, and actors, men whose currency was beauty rather than gold, whose empires existed in verse rather than territory. The first public performance came in the year 60 of the Common Era, when Nero appeared before a carefully selected audience in his private theatre. The stage, draped in silk, the colour of sunset, seemed to glow in the lamplight as the emperor stepped forward, his lyre catching the reflection of flames that danced in bronze braziers placed around the intimate space. Those who witnessed that first performance would later speak of it in hushed tones, their memories coloured by the strange mixture of awe and unease that had filled the air that night. Here was Caesar, descendant of gods, heir to Augustus, master of legions, and he sang of love lost, of heroes fallen, of the sweet melancholy that haunts the hearts of mortals. The melody that emerged from Nero's lyre was not the crude entertainment of a dilettante, but the practiced artistry of one who had spent countless hours in study and preparation. His voice, trained by the finest masters of the age, rose and fell with the controlled passion of a true performer. In that moment, watching their emperor transform himself into something both more and less than divine, the audience glimpsed the complex soul that drove this most enigmatic of rulers. Yet even as Nero discovered the intoxicating power of artistic expression, the machinery of empire continued to turn with relentless precision. In the provinces, governors collected taxes and maintained order. Along the frontiers, legions stood watch against barbarian incursions. In the law courts, justice was dispensed according to precedents established by generations of Roman jurists. The paradox of Nero's reign lay in this strange duality. An emperor who could lose himself completely in the creation of beauty while simultaneously wielding the administrative apparatus of the known world. The senators, those weathered guardians of republican tradition, watched this transformation with growing alarm. They had accepted the necessity of imperial rule, had even embraced the stability it brought after decades of civil war. But an emperor who preferred the company of actors to that of statesmen, who sought applause rather than respect, who valued artistic achievement above military conquest, this challenged their fundamental understanding of what it meant to rule Rome. In the gardens of their suburban villas, these elder statesmen gathered to voice concerns that could never be spoken aloud in the Senate House. They spoke of dignity lost, of traditions abandoned, of an empire that seemed to be drifting away from the stern virtues that had made it great. Yet they also recognized their own powerlessness, trapped as they were between an emperor who commanded the absolute loyalty of the Praetorian Guard and a populace that seemed increasingly charmed by their sovereign's artistic pursuits. The common people of Rome, those whose voices rarely reached the marble halls of power, responded to Nero's performances with an enthusiasm that both delighted and disturbed the emperor's advisors. In the taverns and markets, in the crowded tenements that climbed the city's 7 hills, ordinary Romans spoke with genuine affection of their musical Caesar. Here was a ruler who understood beauty, who could move hearts as well as armies, who brought wonder into lives too often marked by hardship and uncertainty. But popularity, Nero was beginning to learn, was a double-edged sword. The same crowds that cheered his performances also expected increasingly elaborate entertainments. What had begun as intimate recitals grew into grand spectacles, complete with elaborate stage machinery, costume changes, and supporting casts drawn from across the empire. The emperor, who had once found solace in simple melodies, now found himself trapped in an ever-escalating cycle of theatrical excess. It was in this atmosphere of artistic ambition and political tension that Nero conceived his most audacious project yet, a complete reconstruction of the heart of Rome itself, the city that had grown organically over 8 centuries, its narrow streets and cramped buildings bearing witness to generations of organic development, would be swept away and replaced with something worthy of the new golden age that Nero envisioned for his reign. The plans began to take shape in the winter months of the year 63, as Nero worked alongside Greek architects and Roman engineers to design what would become known as the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. This would be no mere palace, but an entire complex of buildings, gardens, and artificial landscapes that would transform the urban core of the eternal city into a living work of art. In the lamplight of his private study, surrounded by scrolls covered with architectural drawings and mathematical calculations, Nero bent over plans that seemed to grow more ambitious with each passing night. Here would be gardens that recreated the landscapes of distant provinces, complete with exotic plants and carefully engineered water features. There would be banquet halls large enough to accommodate hundreds of guests, their ceilings painted with astronomical charts that moved in harmony with the actual heavens. Most spectacular of all would be the revolving dining room, a marvel of engineering that would rotate slowly throughout the evening, offering diners an ever-changing view of the surrounding landscape. The centerpiece of this architectural fantasy would be a colossal bronze statue of Nero himself, standing over 100 feet tall and visible from every corner of the city, dressed as the sun god Sol, with rays of gilded bronze radiating from his crown. This monument would serve as both artistic statement and political symbol, a permanent reminder that the age of Nero represented a new dawn for Roman civilization. Yet, even as these grandiose plans took shape on papyrus and in the emperor's imagination, the practical obstacles seemed almost insurmountable. The dense urban fabric of central Rome, with its temples, markets, and residential districts, covered precisely the area where Nero envisioned his golden palace. Thousands of buildings would need to be demolished, hundreds of thousands of residents relocated, and vast sums of money committed to a project that served no obvious military or administrative purpose. The emperor's advisors, led by the increasingly influential Tigellinus, approached these concerns with the pragmatic ruthlessness that had served them well in the dangerous world of imperial politics. If buildings stood in the way of the emperor's vision, then buildings would be removed. If residents objected to relocation, then compensation would be provided to some and force applied to others. If money was needed, then taxes could be raised and provincial treasuries emptied. The machinery of absolute power, once set in motion, could overcome any obstacle except perhaps the emperor's own changing whims. But the gods, it seemed, had their own plans for the eternal city, plans that would intersect with Nero's ambitions in ways that none could foresee. As the summer of 64 approached, with its oppressive heat and crowded conditions, Rome itself became a tinderbox, waiting for the smallest spark to set it ablaze. The fire began just after midnight on the 19th day of Julius, in the shops that clustered around the great Circus Maximus. The exact cause would never be determined. Perhaps an overturned lamp in a merchant's stall, perhaps sparks from a baker's oven that had burned too hot through the sweltering day. What began as a small blaze among the wooden booths quickly spread to the surrounding buildings, and from there into the heart of the ancient city. The wind that night carried more than smoke and ash. It carried the transformation of an empire and the destiny of an emperor who would forever be remembered for the flames that consumed his capital. Nero, who had been in Antium when the first reports arrived, rushed back to Rome to find a city transformed into something from the underworld itself. The narrow streets that had channeled the life of the Republic for centuries now became corridors of death, filled with smoke so thick that day seemed like night and night like the darkness before creation. The Aventine and Calian hills, once crowned with temples and palaces, glowed like sacrificial altars as buildings that had stood for generations collapsed in showers of sparks and superheated stone. For 6 days and 7 nights, the fire raged through Rome with an intensity that seemed almost supernatural. The Circus Maximus, where hundreds of thousands had cheered the gladiatorial games, became a furnace that consumed not only its own wooden structures, but entire neighborhoods beyond. The Forum, the beating heart of Roman political life, filled with smoke and refugees as shops and temples alike surrendered to the advancing flames. Nero himself, contrary to the stories that would later circulate among his enemies, threw himself into the relief efforts with an energy and dedication that surprised even his closest advisors. He opened his own gardens to house the homeless, organized food distributions from his personal stores, and coordinated the firefighting efforts with a skill that revealed the administrative competence he rarely chose to display. In the temporary command post established in the Campus Martius, the emperor worked through nights made bright by the distant glow of burning buildings, receiving reports from across the city and dispatching orders to civilian officials and military commanders alike. His hands, more accustomed to holding a lyre than military dispatches, became stained with ink and soot as he signed requisitions for food, shelter, and medical supplies. Yet even as Nero struggled to manage the crisis, rumors began to spread through the refugee camps and temporary shelters. Some whispered that the emperor himself had ordered the fire set, that this was merely the first step in his grandiose plan to rebuild Rome according to his artistic vision. Others claimed they had seen him on a rooftop during the worst of the blaze, playing his lyre and singing of the destruction of Troy while his capital burned around him. The truth, as often happens in times of crisis, proved far more complex than the stories that would survive in popular memory. Nero had indeed been composing an epic poem about the fall of Troy, and he had performed excerpts from this work in private recitals. When the fire began, when the ancient city seemed to dissolve into chaos and flame, the parallel with Homeric tragedy was too obvious to ignore. In the minds of a traumatized population seeking someone to blame for their suffering, the emperor's artistic pursuits became evidence of callous indifference or even criminal intent. The fire finally exhausted itself on the 25th day of Julius, leaving behind a landscape of ash and ruin that stretched across 3 of Rome's 14 districts. Nearly 2/3 of the city lay in waste, including landmarks that had defined the urban landscape for centuries. The Temple of Vesta, repository of Rome's sacred flame, had been consumed by flames far more destructive than any it had ever sheltered. The ancient palace of the kings, the Regia, existed now only in memory and scattered stones. In the aftermath, as the sun rose over a city transformed beyond recognition, Nero stood on the Palatine Hill and surveyed the devastation spread below him. The emperor who had dreamed of remaking Rome according to his artistic vision now faced the reality of a capital that nature and circumstance had already remade in ways he had never imagined. The opportunity was unprecedented. Entire districts could be rebuilt from nothing, designed according to the most advanced principles of urban planning and architectural beauty. Yet the cost, both in treasure and in political capital, would prove almost beyond calculation. The reconstruction of Rome began within days of the fire's end, guided by imperial decrees that revealed both Nero's artistic ambitions and his grasp of practical governance. New building codes required wider streets and open spaces that would help prevent future conflagrations. Construction materials were specified to reduce fire risk, with stone and brick replacing the wood that had fed the recent disaster. Public fountains and water sources were mandated for every district, creating both practical firefighting resources and decorative elements that enhanced the beauty of the rebuilt city. But it was in the heart of the devastated area that Nero's true vision began to take shape. Here, where the fire had cleared away centuries of accumulated development, the Golden House began to rise like a flower blooming from scorched earth. The complex that emerged over the following months defied every conventional understanding of what an imperial residence should be. Rather than the fortress-like structure that had characterized earlier imperial palaces, the Domus Aurea spread across its site like a vast villa, its buildings connected by covered walkways and surrounded by carefully designed landscapes that brought the countryside into the heart of the city. Artificial lakes reflected the changing sky, while groves of trees imported from across the empire provided shade and the music of wind through leaves. The interior spaces rivaled anything that had ever been created in the ancient world. Walls were covered with paintings that seemed to extend the rooms into infinite vistas of landscape and sky. Ceilings were covered with gold leaf and precious stones arranged in patterns that caught and reflected light in ways that made the very air seem to shimmer with divine radiance. Mechanical devices, the products of the most advanced engineering of the age, created moving decorations and changing perspectives that transformed each room into a theater of wonder. The famous revolving dining room, when finally completed, represented perhaps the pinnacle of Roman technological achievement. Powered by an ingenious system of water wheels and gears hidden beneath the floor, the circular chamber rotated slowly throughout the day, offering diners views that changed from gardens to lakes to the city beyond. As evening approached and lamps were lit throughout the complex, guests found themselves dining among reflections that multiplied into infinity, creating the illusion of feasting in a palace suspended among the stars. Yet for all its magnificence, the Golden House became a symbol of imperial excess that alienated many Romans who struggled to rebuild their own homes and businesses after the fire. The sight of unlimited resources being poured into artistic projects while ordinary citizens lived in temporary shelters created resentments that would shadow the remainder of Nero's reign. The emperor, who had once been praised for his generous relief efforts, now found himself criticized for the very ambition and creativity that he considered his greatest virtues. The Senate, already uncomfortable with Nero's artistic pursuits, watched the construction of the Golden House with growing alarm. Here was an emperor who seemed to have lost all sense of proportion, who treated the capital of the empire as his personal canvas rather than the sacred center of a civilization. In their private meetings, senators spoke of madness and megalomania, of an autocrat who had forgotten that he ruled by consent rather than divine right. But perhaps the most significant opposition came from an unexpected source: the growing community of Christians who had begun to establish themselves in Rome's poorer districts. These followers of the executed Jewish teacher Jesus had initially attracted little attention from imperial authorities, but Nero's advisors had begun to see them as a convenient scapegoat for the fire and its aftermath. The decision to blame the Christians for the fire represented a calculated political strategy designed to deflect criticism from the emperor himself. These adherents of what most Romans considered a bizarre foreign superstition made perfect targets. They were few, in number, held beliefs that seemed to reject Roman religious traditions, and lacked powerful protectors among the elite. If they could be convincingly portrayed as arsonists and enemies of the state, then Nero's reputation might be salvaged, and his reconstruction plans could proceed without continued public skepticism. The persecution that followed revealed yet another facet of Nero's complex character. The emperor, who composed tender love songs and wept at tragic performances, also proved capable of authorizing spectacles of cruelty that shocked even a population accustomed to gladiatorial games. Christians were thrown to wild animals in the amphitheater, crucified along the roads leading into the city, and burned alive as human torches to illuminate Nero's evening garden parties. Among those who perished in these persecutions were Peter and Paul, the two apostles who had done more than any others to establish Christianity in the capital of the empire. Their deaths, witnessed by small groups of believers who gathered secretly to pray for their martyred leaders, created stories that would outlive the empire itself and transform their persecutor into one of history's most notorious villains. As the Golden House neared completion in the year 66, Nero found himself facing a crisis that would test both his artistic sensibilities and his political survival. The cost of reconstruction, combined with his lavish spending on games and spectacles, had emptied the imperial treasury and forced him to resort to increasingly desperate measures to raise funds. Temples throughout the empire found their sacred treasures requisitioned for imperial use, as Nero's agents stripped gold and silver from religious sites with a thoroughness that suggested either complete indifference to divine displeasure or supreme confidence in his own favored status with the gods. Wealthy Romans discovered that their wills could be challenged and their inheritances redirected to the imperial treasury through legal mechanisms that made resistance both futile and dangerous. The provinces, already heavily taxed to support the machinery of empire, faced additional levies that pushed many communities to the edge of bankruptcy. In Britain, these financial pressures contributed to the revolt led by Boudicca, the warrior queen who united the Celtic tribes in a rebellion that nearly drove Rome from the island altogether. The brutal suppression of this uprising, while militarily successful, further drained resources and created new enemies for an emperor who seemed increasingly isolated from the practical realities of governance. More troubling still were the signs of discontent within the army itself. The legions, long the foundation of imperial power, had begun to question an emperor who seemed more interested in artistic performance than military glory. Veterans who had served under Claudius spoke nostalgically of a ruler who had at least understood the martial virtues that had built the empire. Younger soldiers, influenced by officers who had never fully accepted Nero's legitimacy, began to whisper of alternatives and possibilities that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. In the eastern provinces, these military concerns took on particularly dangerous dimensions. The governor of Syria, a capable general named Corbulo, had successfully concluded a complex war with the Parthian Empire, but his very competence made him a potential threat to an emperor who had never led troops in battle. When Nero summoned Corbulo to Greece, ostensibly to consult on military matters, but actually to remove him from command of his legions, the general's subsequent suicide created a martyrdom that resonated throughout the military establishment. Yet, even as these political storms gathered strength, Nero remained focused on what he considered his true calling. In the year 67, he embarked on a grand tour of Greece, participating in the Olympic Games and other sacred competitions with an enthusiasm that scandalized traditional Romans but delighted his Greek audiences. Here was an emperor who understood and appreciated their culture, who competed not as a conqueror but as a fellow artist seeking recognition for his talents. The sight of the Roman emperor racing chariots and performing tragic monologues before audiences of Greeks struck many as the final abandonment of the dignitas that was supposed to define imperial behavior. That Nero won every competition he entered, victories that were obviously arranged by his terrified hosts, only made the spectacle more embarrassing to Romans who still maintained some connection to their republic heritage. But for Nero himself, these months in Greece represented the fulfillment of a lifelong dream. Surrounded by philosophers, poets, and musicians who appreciated his artistic achievements without reference to his political power, he experienced perhaps the only period of genuine happiness in his adult life. The emperor, who had been shaped by palace intrigue and murderous family dynamics, found himself, for a brief moment, simply a man among men, valued for his talents rather than feared for his authority. The artificial nature of this acceptance, the fact that his victories were gifts rather than achievements, seems to have escaped him entirely. In letter after letter sent back to Rome, Nero described his triumphs with the enthusiasm of a young student, rather than the calculated awareness of a mature ruler. He had collected crowns and prizes that would, he declared, demonstrate to all the world that Rome's emperor was also its greatest artist. Meanwhile, in the capital he had abandoned to pursue his dreams of artistic glory, the forces that would ultimately destroy him were gathering strength and purpose. Senators who had long resented his autocratic tendencies now spoke openly of the need for change. Military commanders who had watched competent colleagues destroyed for political reasons began to consider the unthinkable possibility of rebellion. Even the common people, once charmed by their musical emperor, had begun to grumble about taxes and shortages that seemed directly connected to imperial extravagance. The irony was complete. Nero, who had sought to transform himself into a figure of artistic immortality, had instead created the conditions for his own political destruction. The emperor, who had dreamed of being remembered as a patron of beauty and culture, was instead creating the legacy of a tyrant whose artistic pretensions had blinded him to the fundamental requirements of successful rule. As the year 67 drew to a close and reports from Rome grew increasingly alarming, even Nero began to sense that his Greek idol might be reaching its end. The competitions that had seemed so important just months earlier now appeared trivial compared to the growing crisis in the capital. The artistic achievements that had filled him with such pride seemed suddenly fragile when weighed against the possibility of losing everything he had inherited from Claudius and Agrippina. In the cold clarity of a winter morning in Athens, standing before a temple where he had just received another meaningless crown, Nero finally understood that the time for performance was ending and the time for survival was about to begin. The emperor, who had spent his reign trying to escape the brutal realities of imperial power, was about to discover that power, once seized, demands constant vigilance to maintain. The dreams of artistic glory that had sustained him through years of political compromise were about to collide with forces that cared nothing for beauty and everything for the simple, ancient logic of strength and legitimacy that had always governed the succession of Roman rulers. The golden palace that rose from the ashes of the Great Fire would soon stand empty, its revolutionary dining room spinning uselessly in the gathering darkness of an empire that had begun to question not just its emperor's competence, but his very right to rule. The boy who had been thrust onto the throne by his mother's ambition and maintained there by advisors who understood power better than he did, was about to face the ultimate test of his reign. Not whether he could create beauty, but whether he could preserve the empire that made such creation possible. As winter deepened across the Mediterranean, and the first hints of rebellion began to reach even the insulated world of imperial correspondence, Nero prepared to return to a Rome that would no longer recognize him as the artistic visionary he had believed himself to be, but rather as a ruler whose time was rapidly running out. The stage was set for the final act of a tragedy that had been years in the making, a drama in which the emperor, who had sought to direct every scene, would discover that history itself had already written his ending. The wine that had once tasted of power now carried the bitter aftertaste of suspicion. In the marble halls where laughter had echoed, whispers now moved like shadows between columns, carrying words that would not dare speak themselves in daylight. The emperor, who had dreamed of being loved by all, found himself surrounded by faces that smiled while their hearts plotted in darkness. In the year 65, when spring flowers bloomed in Roman gardens and the Tiber reflected the golden light of a seemingly peaceful empire, beneath the surface of imperial splendor, a different kind of seed was taking root. Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a senator whose lineage traced back to the Republic's noble days, sat in his villa as shadows lengthened across marble floors. Around him gathered men whose names would echo through history, not for their achievements, but for their audacity to dream of ending an emperor's reign. The Pisonian conspiracy, as historians would name it, was born not from a single moment of rage, but from the slow accumulation of grievances that had settled like dust in the corners of senatorial hearts. Piso himself was a man of letters and philosophy, his speeches in the Senate marked by eloquence that reminded older Romans of the days when words carried weight equal to swords. Yet even such a man found himself contemplating the unthinkable, the death of Caesar. Among the conspirators moved figures from every level of Roman society. Flavus Scaevinus, whose very name seemed to whisper of ancient republican virtue, brought with him the passion of a man who had watched the Senate's power diminish year by year under Nero's increasingly autocratic rule. Lucan, the young poet whose verses had once praised the very emperor he now sought to destroy, carried within his breast the bitter knowledge that artistic excellence meant nothing to a ruler who valued only his own creative pursuits above all others. The conspiracy spread like wine spilled across a white toga, staining everything it touched with the dark promise of change. In the Praetorian barracks, where loyalty was supposedly as solid as the bronze eagles that watched over Roman legions, even there the whispers found fertile ground. Faenius Rufus, prefect of the very guard sworn to protect the emperor's life, found himself torn between duty and the growing conviction that Rome itself might be better served by Nero's death than by his continued reign. The plan, when it crystallized in those dangerous spring months, possessed the elegant simplicity that marked the best Roman strategies. During the races at the Circus Maximus, when Nero would be surrounded by the cheering crowds he so desperately craved, when his attention would be fixed upon the thundering hooves and the roar of approval that fed his hungry ego, there the conspirators would strike. In that moment of triumph and celebration, they would transform the emperor's greatest joy into his final scene. Yet conspiracies, like the most delicate of Roman glasswork, are fragile things, beautiful in their conception, but prone to shattering at the slightest touch of reality. It was a freedman named Milicus, a man whose very existence depended upon the favor of his former master Scaevinus, who would prove to be the instrument of the plot's destruction. When Scaevinus prepared for what he believed would be his moment of historical glory, when he sharpened an ancient dagger and freed his slaves and wrote his will with the careful deliberation of a man preparing for martyrdom, Milicus observed these preparations with the calculating eye of one who understood that empires rewarded loyalty and punished treason with equal intensity. The revelation came to Nero like a thunderbolt thrown by Jupiter himself. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the emperor often found himself restless with the weight of power and the burden of his own artistic visions, word came that his very life hung by a thread thinner than the strings of his beloved lyre. The man who had dreamed of being Rome's greatest actor found himself cast in a role he had never imagined, that of the hunted sovereign, surrounded by enemies who wore the faces of friends. What followed was a purge that would stain the marble of Rome with blood and fill the air with the smoke of funeral pyres. The emperor who had once sought to rule through charm and cultural patronage now revealed the iron fist that had always lurked beneath the silk glove. Piso himself, the man who would have been emperor, faced his death with the dignity that Roman tradition demanded, opening his veins in a warm bath while dictating final verses that spoke of duty to Rome and the eternal nature of honor. Lucan, the poet whose words had once soared like eagles above the forum, met his end with a bitter irony that would have appealed to his literary sensibilities. As his blood flowed from opened veins, he recited lines from his own Pharsalia, verses describing a soldier's death on a distant battlefield. The young man who had sought to kill Caesar with steel found himself destroyed by the very poetry that had made his name immortal. But it was Seneca's death that would haunt Nero most deeply in the years to come. The old philosopher, the man who had guided his steps from boy to emperor, who had whispered wisdom in his ear and shaped his understanding of power and responsibility, now stood accused of complicity in the plot to end his life. Whether Seneca truly participated in the conspiracy would remain a question that history could never definitively answer, but in the paranoid atmosphere that followed the plot's discovery, suspicion was sufficient for condemnation. The death of Seneca unfolded like a scene from one of the Greek tragedies the old man had so loved. Ordered to take his own life, the philosopher approached death with the same methodical precision he had brought to questions of ethics and governance. Yet his aged body, weakened by years of contemplation and ascetic practices, proved stubborn in releasing his spirit. The veins that should have carried him swiftly to whatever lay beyond instead delivered his departure slowly, painfully, while his young wife, Pompeia Paulina, sought to join him in death until Nero's soldiers intervened to save her life. In the steam of a hot bath, surrounded by friends who transcribed his final words, Seneca passed from the world he had tried so hard to understand and improve. His death marked not just the end of a life, but the severing of Nero's last connection to the philosophical ideals that had once shaped his reign. The teacher was gone, and the student was left alone with power that no longer carried the restraint of wisdom. With the blood of conspirators still fresh on the stones of Roman justice, Nero found himself changed in ways that went deeper than the surface relief of survival. The young man who had once sought approval now seemed to care little for the opinions of senators and nobles. Instead, he turned increasingly to the one audience that had never betrayed him, never plotted against him, never whispered of daggers in dark corners, the people of Rome themselves, gathered in vast amphitheatres and circuses where his voice could reach thousands at once. The emperor's appearances on stage, which had once been private entertainments or carefully orchestrated events for select audiences, now became grand public spectacles that scandalized the traditional elements of Roman society while delighting the masses. In the theatre of Pompeii, beneath statues of Rome's greatest generals and poets, Nero would stand in actor's costume and deliver monologues from Greek tragedy with a passion that seemed to pour from the very depths of his soul. Those who watched him perform in those years after the conspiracy spoke of an intensity that bordered on the supernatural. When Nero portrayed Orestes, the matricidal prince of Greek legend, his anguish seemed to echo from personal experience rather than mere theatrical training. When he sang of Oedipus, blinded and wandering, those in the audience felt they witnessed not just an emperor playing a role, but a man confronting the darkest possibilities of his own nature. The traditional Roman elite watched these performances with a mixture of fascination and horror. To them, the sight of Caesar dressed as a common actor, competing for applause like any street performer, represented a fundamental betrayal of the dignity that power demanded. Yet they could not deny the emperor's talent, nor could they ignore the genuine enthusiasm of the crowds that filled every venue where he appeared. Nero's artistic ambitions soon expanded beyond the theatres of Rome itself. In 66, he announced his intention to compete in the Olympic Games, that most sacred of Greek competitions where for centuries athletes had gathered to honor the gods with displays of physical excellence. But Nero would not content himself with the traditional events of running and wrestling. He would compete as a charioteer and as a performer, bringing his lyre to the sacred grounds where Homer had once been honored. The journey to Greece was orchestrated like a military campaign, with advanced scouts preparing the way and logistical trains ensuring that the emperor's enormous entourage would want for nothing. When Nero's ship finally departed from Brundisium, its purple sails catching the Mediterranean wind, those who watched from the shore understood they were witnessing something unprecedented in Roman history, an emperor abandoning his capital, not for conquest, but for art. In Greece, Nero found the validation that had eluded him in Rome's politically charged atmosphere. The Greeks, with their ancient appreciation for artistic excellence and their tradition of honoring performers alongside warriors and statesmen, received the emperor with enthusiasm that seemed genuine rather than merely politic. In cities where Pericles had once walked and Sophocles had premiered his tragedies, Nero performed to audiences who understood the cultural significance of what they witnessed. The Olympic Games of 67 would be remembered not just for their unusual circumstances, but for the unprecedented sight of an emperor competing alongside common citizens in pursuit of victory wreaths made from simple olive branches. Nero's chariot race became the stuff of legend, though not for the reasons he might have hoped. When his vehicle overturned and he was thrown to the ground, unable to complete the course, the judges nonetheless declared him the winner, a decision that would echo through history as an example of power corrupting even the most sacred traditions. Yet, in his musical competitions, Nero's victories carried more legitimacy. His voice, trained by the best teachers in the empire and honed through years of dedicated practice, impressed even those Greek judges who had no reason to flatter Roman authority. When he sang the tragic arias that had moved audiences from Syria to Spain, the applause that thundered through ancient amphitheatres contained genuine appreciation alongside diplomatic necessity. The emperor returned to Rome after more than a year in Greece, laden with victory crowns and drunk on the approval of audiences who had embraced him as an artist, rather than merely endured him as a ruler. He entered the city through a breach made specially in the ancient walls, riding in the chariot that Augustus had once used for his triumphs, wearing the purple robe of Jupiter himself. The message was clear to all who witnessed this unprecedented spectacle. Nero no longer distinguished between his roles as emperor and performer. While Nero pursued artistic glory on Greek stages, the vast machinery of empire that Augustus had so carefully constructed began to show signs of strain that could no longer be ignored or dismissed. In distant provinces where Roman eagles had once guaranteed peace and prosperity, new fires of rebellion flickered to life, fed by grievances that had accumulated during years of imperial neglect and mismanagement. In Judea, where the complex relationship between Roman authority and Jewish tradition had always required the most delicate handling, the situation had deteriorated beyond the point where diplomacy could provide solutions. The procurator Gessius Florus, a man whose greed and brutality had alienated even those Jews who had previously cooperated with Roman rule, pushed the province toward open revolt through a series of provocations that seemed almost calculated to inflame religious sensibilities. The Jewish war that erupted in 66 would prove to be one of the most brutal conflicts in Roman history, a struggle that went far beyond mere political rebellion to encompass fundamental questions of identity, faith, and cultural survival. In Jerusalem, where the great temple built by Herod still gleamed with gold and marble, zealots and moderates found themselves united by the conviction that Roman rule had become intolerable. Vespasian, the general charged with suppressing the rebellion, approached the task with the methodical precision that had made him one of Rome's most effective military commanders. Yet even he recognized that this conflict differed from the usual provincial uprising. The Jews fought not just for political independence, but for the preservation of a way of life that they believed God Himself had ordained. Their resistance carried the desperate intensity of people who saw no alternative to victory except annihilation. The siege warfare that characterized much of the Jewish conflict played out against a backdrop of internal Roman tensions that grew more pronounced with each passing month of Nero's absence from the capital. While the emperor competed for olive wreaths in Greek competitions, his administrators struggled to maintain the delicate balance of taxation and expenditure that kept the empire functioning. The financial strain of Nero's ambitious building projects, combined with the cost of maintaining Roman forces in multiple theaters of conflict, had begun to tell on the imperial treasury in ways that even creative accounting could no longer disguise. Provincial governors found themselves under increasing pressure to extract ever larger revenues from populations already stretched to their limits by years of heavy taxation. In Gaul, where Caesar's conquests had once seemed to secure Roman rule, for all time, whispers of discontent grew louder among tribal leaders, who remembered when their ancestors had ruled themselves according to their own laws and customs. The Gallic noble Julius Vindex, whose very name proclaimed his family's integration into Roman society, found himself torn between loyalty to the empire that had elevated his status and growing conviction that Nero's rule had become detrimental to the very idea of Roman civilization. Vindex's rebellion, when it finally erupted in 68, carried symbolic weight that transcended its limited military significance. Here was a man who embodied the success of Roman integration policies, a provincial aristocrat who had risen to high rank through merit and loyalty, now taking up arms against the very system that had created him. His rebellion spoke to deeper currents of dissatisfaction that ran through the empire like underground rivers, hidden from surface view, but carrying the potential to undermine the most solid foundations. The revolt in Gaul might have remained a localized affair, easily suppressed by the superior training and equipment of Roman legions, if it had not coincided with growing discontent among the military commanders themselves. In Spain, where Galba governed with the stern efficiency that had characterized his long career, news of Vindex's rebellion arrived at a moment when the governor was already contemplating the unthinkable. The possibility that removing Nero might serve Rome's interests better than continuing to support him. Galba was no young hothead dreaming of glory, no ambitious general seeking to carve out a personal empire through military adventure. At 73, he had served Rome faithfully for decades, earning respect through competence rather than brilliance, through steady loyalty rather than spectacular achievement. When such a man began to question the legitimacy of imperial authority, it signaled that the crisis had moved beyond the realm of ordinary political maneuvering into something far more fundamental. The emperor, who had once dreamed of being beloved by all Romans, now found himself confronting the bitter reality that love could not be commanded, that artistic excellence could not substitute for political wisdom, and that even the most magnificent performances meant nothing if the audience was no longer willing to believe in the drama being presented. News traveled slowly in the ancient world, carried by riders whose horses' hooves marked out the rhythm of imperial communication across thousands of miles of Roman roads. When word finally reached Nero of Vindex's rebellion in Gaul, the emperor was still basking in the afterglow of his Greek victories, still surrounded by the artists and courtiers who found it convenient to praise his every artistic gesture while remaining silent about the political storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The initial reports seemed almost laughable to those who surrounded Nero in his golden palace. Vindex commanded no legions, possessed no war chest sufficient to sustain a prolonged campaign, and led a population that had been peaceful under Roman rule for over a century. How could such a man pose a serious threat to the power of Caesar, backed as it was by the most formidable military machine the world had ever seen? Yet Nero's own reaction to news of the rebellion revealed the depth of insecurity that artistic triumphs had failed to heal. The emperor, who had performed before thousands without showing a trace of nervousness, now paced his chambers with the restless energy of a caged animal, alternating between bursts of rage that sent servants scurrying for cover and periods of brooding silence that those who knew him had learned to fear even more than his anger. The decision to send Lucius Virginius Rufus to suppress Vindex's rebellion seemed logical enough from a military perspective. Rufus commanded the legions of Germania Superior, troops whose discipline and fighting ability had been proven in countless engagements along the Rhine frontier. These were soldiers who had faced Germanic warriors in the dark forests beyond the river, men who understood that Roman civilization depended upon their willingness to stand firm against barbarism. But the campaign against Vindex would prove to be unlike any conventional military operation, for it forced Roman soldiers to confront questions that went beyond simple obedience to orders. When Rufus's legions encountered Vindex's forces near Vesontio, the battle that followed was decided not by superior tactics or equipment, but by the fundamental hollowness of the rebellion itself. Vindex died in the fighting, and his army melted away like snow under a spring sun. Yet victory over Vindex brought Nero no real relief, for it became immediately clear that the Gallic rebellion had been merely the first tremor of a much larger earthquake. In Spain, Galba's declaration against Nero's rule carried the authority of a man whose loyalty to Rome itself had never been questioned. When Galba proclaimed that he served the Senate and people of Rome rather than the individual who currently wore the purple, he gave voice to sentiments that had been growing in strength throughout the empire. The psychological impact of Galba's rebellion far exceeded its immediate military significance. Here was a governor whose record of service stretched back to the reign of Augustus, a man who embodied the old republican virtues that many Romans believed their empire had forgotten. When such a figure declared Nero unfit to rule, it provided a focal point for all the accumulated grievances and disappointments that had been building during the 13 years of the emperor's reign. In Rome itself, the news of Galba's declaration created an atmosphere of uncertainty that penetrated every level of society. In the Senate House, where carefully modulated phrases had long substituted for honest political debate, senators found themselves forced to contemplate questions they had avoided for years. Could loyalty to Rome require disloyalty to Caesar? Was it possible that the empire they had served faithfully might be better served by a different emperor? Among the Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers whose primary duty was the protection of the emperor's person, the crisis created divisions that threatened the very foundation of imperial security. Nymphidius Sabinus, who had risen to command of the guard through a combination of competence and careful political maneuvering, found himself caught between his oath of loyalty to Nero and his growing conviction that the emperor's continued rule posed a threat to the stability of the empire itself. The guards who had once competed for the honor of serving in Nero's presence now whispered among themselves in the corridors of their barracks, debating questions that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. Their conversations, conducted in the abbreviated phrases and meaningful glances that soldiers used when discussing dangerous topics, gradually built toward a consensus that would prove fatal to the emperor they had sworn to protect. As spring turned to summer in the year 68, Nero found himself increasingly isolated even within his own palace. The courtiers who had once competed for his attention now seemed distracted, their praise carrying a hollow quality that suggested their thoughts were elsewhere. Servants who had once rushed to fulfill his every whim now moved with the careful deliberation of people who understood that their world might change at any moment. The emperor who had dreamed of transforming Rome into a stage worthy of his artistic vision now discovered that he had become the central character in a drama far darker than any Greek tragedy he had ever performed. The audience that mattered most, the military commanders, the senators, the Praetorian guards, the common people of Rome itself, was no longer applauding. The silence that greeted his increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control carried the weight of a judgment more final than any theatrical review. In the quiet hours before dawn, when sleep eluded him and the weight of the purple seemed heavier than any costume he had ever worn, Nero began to understand that the greatest performance of his life was nearing its final act. The stage was set. The other players had taken their positions, and the ending that approached would be written not by imperial will, but by forces that had moved beyond any single man's ability to control. The boy who had become emperor at 16, who had dreamed of being loved by all the world, who had sought to achieve immortality through art rather than conquest, now faced the approaching darkness with the knowledge that history would remember him, not for his victories, but for his failures, not for the beauty he had tried to create, but for the chaos that had grown in its shadow. The final curtain was rising, and Caesar would have to face what lay beyond without the comfort of knowing how the story would end. The whispered conversations in shadowed alcoves grew more urgent with each passing day. Galba's name travelled through the provinces like wildfire through dry grass, carrying with it the promise of order restored and dignity returned to the purple. In distant Hispania, the elderly governor stood before his legions, their shields glinting in the Spanish sun, their faces hard with purpose. The eagles that had once bent the knee to Caesar now stirred restlessly, sensing the change that moved like a storm across the Mediterranean. Back in Rome, Nero's world contracted like shadows at noon. The golden palace that had once echoed with laughter and song now felt vast and hollow, its corridors stretching endlessly into darkness. He wandered through rooms filled with treasures looted from across the empire, Greek statues with their marble eyes following his movements, Egyptian gold that caught the light like trapped sunfire, Persian tapestries that whispered secrets in languages older than Rome itself. Yet for all their beauty, these objects seemed suddenly foreign, as if they belonged to someone else's dream. The emperor's fingers trembled as he practiced his lyre, the strings singing melancholy notes that drifted through the palace like autumn leaves. His voice, once praised by sycophantic courtiers, now seemed small and fragile against the weight of approaching doom. He sang of Troy burning, of heroes falling, of empires turning to dust, prophetic words that he perhaps did not fully understand, even as they spilled from his lips like wine from a cracked amphora. Tigellinus, his once reliable confidant, moved through the palace like a man walking through a cemetery, his eyes darting constantly toward the exits. The Praetorian prefect, who had orchestrated so many schemes, who had whispered poison into imperial ears and turned suspicion into execution, now felt the cold breath of retribution on his neck. He spoke less frequently to his emperor, offering platitudes instead of the bold counsel that had once shaped policy. Even the most devoted servants sensed the shift in the wind and began to calculate their own survival. News arrived like ravens bearing ill omens. Vindex in Gaul had raised his standard against Rome, though his rebellion would soon be crushed by loyal legions. Yet his death only served to water the seeds of discontent, for other governors watched and waited, measuring the emperor's response, gauging his strength. In Germania, troops whispered of their commanders' private meetings. In Syria, legions that had once marched for Roman glory now questioned whom they truly served. Nero summoned his advisors to the throne room, that vast space where marble columns rose like fossilized trees toward a ceiling painted with scenes of divine triumph. The emperor sat upon his chair of ivory and gold, but the power that had once radiated from this seat like heat from a forge now seemed diminished, uncertain. When he spoke of raising new legions, of marching personally to crush the rebels, his words fell flat against the polished stone. The men who surrounded him nodded with their mouths while their eyes betrayed their true thoughts. It was Epaphroditus, his loyal freedman, who finally spoke the truth that others feared to voice. Standing before the throne with the quiet dignity of a man who had served faithfully through both triumph and disaster, he told his emperor what the whispers in the marketplace already knew. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the people. The words hung in the air like incense smoke, visible and choking. Nero's face, still boyishly round despite his 30 years, crumpled as if struck by an invisible hand. The decree meant more than political maneuvering or temporary exile. It was a sentence of death delivered in the formal Latin that had governed Roman law for centuries. According to ancient custom, an enemy of the people could be killed by any citizen, his body denied burial, his memory erased from official records. The emperor who had dreamed of eternal glory through art and architecture now faced the prospect of his name being chiseled away from monuments as if he had never existed at all. That night, as torches flickered in their bronze holders, and the palace settled into its usual nocturnal quiet, Nero walked alone through the gardens where he had once performed for adoring crowds. The roses his mother had planted still bloomed along the pathways, their petals soft as silk in the moonlight, their fragrance carrying memories of happier times when the future had seemed bright with possibility. He touched their thorns and felt the small pain as welcome proof that he still lived, still felt, still existed in a world that increasingly treated him as already dead. The decision to flee came not as a moment of clarity, but as a gradual acceptance of inevitable defeat. Nero gathered a small group of faithful companions: Epaphroditus, the actor Sporus whom he had freed and cherished, and a handful of servants whose loyalty ran deeper than political convenience. They slipped from the palace before dawn, moving through Rome's sleeping streets like ghosts returning to the underworld. The city that had once cheered his name now felt hostile even in darkness. Every shadow might conceal an assassin, every doorway an enemy waiting to claim the reward for his capture. The emperor who had commanded legions across 3 continents now pulled his cloak close and hurried through alleys where beggars slept. and stray dogs fought over scraps. The irony was not lost on him. He who had lived surrounded by marble and gold now sought refuge among the forgotten and abandoned. They made their way to a villa owned by Phaon, one of Nero's freedmen, located some 4 miles outside the city walls. The property sat among rolling hills covered with olive trees and vineyards, a modest estate that seemed impossibly peaceful compared to the chaos they had left behind. Here, in a simple room with whitewashed walls and rough wooden furniture, the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty prepared to face his final act. The hours crawled by like wounded animals. Nero paced the small chamber, sometimes weeping, sometimes raging, sometimes falling into a silence so profound it seemed to absorb sound itself. He spoke of the artistic works he would never complete, the melodies that would die with him, the grand performances that would remain forever unperformed. His companions watched with the helpless devotion of those who love someone beyond the reach of salvation. As the sun reached its zenith, bringing news that Galba's supporters were searching house by house, Nero finally understood that his flight had merely postponed the inevitable. The Senate had confirmed Galba as emperor, and already the new regime was consolidating power, issuing orders, making plans for a Rome that would exist without him. The empire he had inherited as a boy would continue its ancient rhythm, sunrise and sunset, planting and harvest, conquest and administration, as if he had never been born. He called for water and a mirror, studying his reflection with the same intensity he had once brought to memorizing scripts. The face that looked back at him bore little resemblance to the confident youth who had ascended the throne 14 years earlier. Lines of worry and excess had carved themselves into his features, while his eyes held a knowledge too bitter for his years. Yet even now, contemplating death, he could not resist arranging his hair, adjusting his toga, preparing for his final performance with the vanity that had always been both his gift and his curse. The sound of approaching horses shattered the afternoon stillness like stone thrown through glass. Nero's companions rushed to the windows, their faces confirming what they all knew. The searchers had found them at last. Time, which had seemed endless during the long morning of waiting, now compressed into heartbeats, each one counting down toward an ending that could no longer be delayed or denied. With trembling hands, Nero took the dagger that Epaphroditus offered, its blade catching the light streaming through the villa's simple windows. He had always been a creature of theatre, of grand gestures and dramatic speeches. Yet now he found himself facing the most important performance of his life in a setting stripped of all pageantry. No audience filled marble seats to witness his final act. No musicians played accompaniment to his last words. There was only the small room, the faithful servants, and the weight of choice that had followed him from the golden palace to this humble refuge. "What an artist perishes in me," he whispered, the words carrying all the sorrow of songs unsung and dreams unrealized. It was not the cry of a tyrant facing justice, but of a creator confronting the silence that would swallow his voice forever. He had genuinely believed that his art would redeem his failures, that future generations would remember his music rather than his murders, his poetry rather than his politics. In that moment of final clarity, he perhaps understood that fame built on beauty lasts longer than power built on fear. The dagger's point pressed against his throat, cold as winter metal, sharp as the truth he had spent years avoiding. Yet still, he hesitated, not from cowardice but from the deep human reluctance to step from the known world into unknowable darkness. He who had ordered so many deaths now discovered that ending one's own life required a different kind of courage, a willingness to release not just breath, but every possibility that tomorrow might bring. Epaphroditus, seeing his master's struggle, gently helped guide the blade home. It was an act of love as much as duty, the final service of a servant who had witnessed both the glory and degradation of imperial power. Blood flowed warm over the emperor's fingers as his voice faded to a whisper, then to nothing at all. The man who had believed himself divine died with the same mortal frailty as any common citizen, his blood the same red as theirs, his silence just as complete. Outside, the searchers hammered on the villa's door, their shouts echoing through rooms that would never again hear their target's voice. When they finally broke through, they found only a body growing cold and servants weeping over their fallen master. The great hunt had ended not with capture and public execution, but with a private death that robbed the new regime of its triumph. Nero had escaped their justice by embracing his own. News of Nero's death spread through Rome like oil poured on water, touching every corner of the city with its dark gleam. In the Forum, citizens gathered to hear official proclamations read, in voices carefully neutral, as if the speakers themselves were not certain how to feel about the emperor's end. Some cheered, remembering the fires and executions, the taxes and extravagances that had marked his reign. Others wept, recalling the games and spectacles, the artistic patronage and building projects that had brought beauty to their lives. Praetorian Guard, those elite soldiers who had sworn sacred oaths to protect the emperor's life, now found themselves masterless, their loyalty suddenly worthless as yesterday's bread. They removed their distinctive crests and insignia, storing them away like costumes after a play has ended. Some would serve the new emperor when he arrived from Spain. Others would fade into the civilian population, carrying their secrets and memories like scars hidden beneath ordinary clothes. Galba entered Rome with the dignity of a man who had earned his position through merit rather than inheritance. Silver-haired and stern-faced, he represented everything Nero had not: military discipline, fiscal responsibility, adherence to ancient Roman virtues. Yet even as the Senate formally welcomed their new leader, whispers began about the harsh measures he would need to take to restore order. The treasury was empty, the legions restless, the provinces uncertain. Nero's death had ended one problem only to reveal a dozen others lurking beneath the surface. In the eastern provinces, where Nero's patronage of Greek culture had made him genuinely popular, the news brought grief rather than celebration. Temples that had honored him as a god now stood uncertain, their priests unsure whether to remove his statues or wait to see what the new emperor might demand. Actors and musicians who had enjoyed imperial favor found themselves suddenly vulnerable, their art associated with the fallen regime. Some fled to distant cities where Roman politics mattered less than talent. Others burned their compositions and took up more practical trades. The Golden Palace itself became a monument to impermanence. Galba's agents walked through its halls, cataloguing treasures that would be sold to refill the treasury. marking artworks that would be removed to more traditional settings. The artificial lake where Nero had staged naval battles was drained and filled, its waters redirected to more practical purposes. Plans were drawn up to build amphitheatres and baths, where once had stood gardens dedicated purely to aesthetic pleasure. Yet even as the new regime worked to erase physical traces of Nero's rule, they could not so easily eliminate the questions his reign had raised about the nature of power and its proper use. His attempts to transform the emperorship from a military office into something more akin to Hellenistic kingship had failed. But the ideas behind those attempts continued to echo in private conversations and philosophical discussions. Future emperors would be more careful about how they expressed their cultural interests, but they would not abandon culture entirely. Time moved forward with its relentless patience, measuring years in dynasties, decades in architectural projects, centuries in the slow evolution of law and custom. The Flavian emperors who followed Galba's brief reign built their own monuments on the foundations of Nero's demolished palace, most notably the great amphitheatre that would bear their name throughout history. Yet even as new stones rose where old ones had fallen, something of Nero's vision persisted in the very grandeur of these projects, their scale and ambition speaking to dreams larger than any single lifetime. Historians began the long work of understanding what had happened during those 14 years of increasingly chaotic rule. Tacitus, with his gift for moral complexity, would paint a portrait of an emperor corrupted by absolute power, yet capable of genuine artistic achievement. Suetonius would catalogue scandals and excesses with the precision of an accountant balancing books. Dio Cassius would examine the political mechanisms that had allowed such a ruler to emerge and persist. Each would contribute pieces to a puzzle that no single perspective could complete. In the provinces that had loved him, small shrines continued to honor Nero's memory long after official Rome had condemned it. Freedmen who had prospered under his patronage told stories to their children about an emperor who had valued talent over birth, art over conquest. Actors performed plays celebrating his theatrical gifts, while musicians composed songs that preserved fragments of melodies he had created. These underground streams of memory flowed beneath the surface of imperial disapproval, carrying forward truths that official histories chose to ignore. The Senate, in its wisdom, decreed that Nero's name should be erased from public inscriptions, his images removed from coins and statues. Yet they could not erase him from the collective memory of Rome itself. The city he had rebuilt after the Great Fire bore his architectural vision in its wide streets and organized districts. The harbor he had expanded continued to welcome ships from across the Mediterranean. The aqueducts he had extended still carried fresh water to neighborhoods that might otherwise have remained thirsty and poor. Perhaps most persistently, his influence lived on in the very idea of what an emperor could be. Before Nero, the Principate had been largely military and administrative in character, its cultural aspects subordinate to practical governance. His reign had demonstrated both the dangers and possibilities of a ruler who saw himself as patron of the arts, protector of the beautiful, champion of cultural refinement. Future emperors would be more subtle in their artistic pursuits, but they would pursue them nonetheless. Marcus Aurelius would write philosophy while campaigning on distant frontiers. Hadrian would compose poetry and design buildings with the skill of a professional architect. Diocletian would retreat from power to grow cabbages in his palace gardens. Each in his own way would echo something of Nero's belief that imperial power could serve ends beyond mere conquest and control, that a ruler might legitimately concern himself with beauty as well as borders. Centuries flowed past like water finding its way to the sea, carrying forward fragments of story, pieces of legend, whispers of truth mixed inextricably with elaborations and distortions. The Roman Empire itself transformed and divided, its western half eventually falling to barbarian kingdoms, while its eastern portion evolved into something new, yet recognizably connected to its origins. Through all these changes, the figure of Nero persisted in human imagination, like a haunting melody that returns unbidden to the mind. Medieval chroniclers, working by candlelight in monastery scriptoriums, copied and recopied the ancient accounts, sometimes adding their own interpretations or moral commentary. To Christian writers, Nero became the archetypal persecutor, the emperor who had fed their spiritual ancestors to lions and burned them as torches to light his gardens. Yet even these hostile accounts could not entirely suppress evidence of his complexity, his genuine grief at his mother's death, his artistic ambitions, his attempts to reform Roman law in more humane directions. Renaissance humanists rediscovering classical texts with fresh eyes began to see in Nero a figure more nuanced than simple villainy could contain. They noted his patronage of learning, his encouragement of Greek cultural traditions, his attempts to make the empire more inclusive of diverse populations. Some even suggested that his artistic pursuits represented a higher form of imperial ambition than mere military conquest, though they were careful to couch such observations in properly diplomatic language. The archaeological spade would eventually uncover physical traces of his reign. Fragments of wall paintings from the Golden Palace, coins bearing his carefully sculpted profile, inscriptions mentioning building projects that had been forgotten by literary tradition. These material remains spoke in a different voice than written histories, revealing the practical achievements that political prejudice had obscured. They showed an emperor who had genuinely cared about urban planning, public amenities, and the daily lives of ordinary citizens. Modern scholarship, with its tools of psychological analysis and social history, would attempt to understand Nero within the context of his times rather than judging him by standards developed centuries later. They would explore the impossible pressures of his position, inheriting absolute power as a teenager, surrounded by advisors with their own agendas, expected to embody both human and divine authority, while remaining recognizably mortal. The picture that emerged was neither the monster of popular imagination, nor the misunderstood artist of romantic rehabilitation, but something more complex and ultimately more human. Yet perhaps the most enduring aspect of Nero's legacy lay not in academic understanding, but in the persistent questions his reign raised about the relationship between power and creativity, authority and beauty, political responsibility and personal fulfillment. Every generation would find in his story reflections of their own struggles with these eternal dilemmas, seeing in his rise and fall a cautionary tale about the corrupting effects of unchecked power, or a tragedy about the impossibility of serving both art and empire with equal devotion. In the end, the story of Nero becomes larger than any single life, expanding beyond the boundaries of first-century Rome to encompass fundamental questions about human nature and the exercise of power. His reign demonstrated how quickly political authority could transform from promise into threat, how the very structures designed to ensure stability could become instruments of oppression. Yet it also showed the enduring human hunger for beauty and meaning, the deep need to create something lasting in a world where everything ultimately turns to dust. The boy who had ascended the throne with such bright hopes, surrounded by the best tutors money could buy and advised by philosophers who genuinely believed in the possibility of enlightened rule, had faced the same fundamental challenge that confronts every holder of power: how to remain human while wielding authority over other humans. His failure was spectacular and well documented, but it was also instructive in ways that pure success could never have been. Through his artistic pursuits, Nero had gestured toward a different kind of imperial legacy, one based on cultural achievement rather than military conquest, on the creation of beauty rather than the acquisition of territory. His vision of an emperor as patron and performer, as someone who enriched civilization rather than merely administering it, would resurface again and again throughout history in various forms. Sometimes it would succeed spectacularly. More often, it would fail, but the aspiration itself proved remarkably persistent. His personal relationships with his mother, his wives, his advisors, his subjects, revealed the impossible isolation that absolute power creates. Surrounded by people who depended on his favor for their livelihood or their lives, he had struggled to find genuine human connection. His artistic collaborations provided some relief from this isolation, offering moments of authentic communication through shared creative work. Yet even these relationships were ultimately corrupted by the imbalance of power that made true friendship impossible. The religious dimensions of his reign, from his deification by provincial populations to his persecution of Christian communities, reflected the complex spiritual landscape of the first century. His understanding of himself as divine was neither pure megalomania nor cynical political calculation, but rather an attempt to find meaning and purpose in a role that had no clear precedents or limitations. The Eastern traditions that saw rulers as gods offered one model. The Roman customs that emphasized civic duty offered another. His tragedy lay partly in his inability to reconcile these competing demands. Even his cruelties and excesses, while inexcusable, revealed something important about the corrupting effects of unlimited power on human psychology. The teenager who had wept at the prospect of signing his first death warrant became the man who could order executions with casual indifference. This transformation was neither sudden nor inexplicable. It unfolded gradually, decision by decision, compromise by compromise, until the original person had disappeared entirely beneath layers of accumulated moral debris. Now, across the span of centuries, his voice has fallen silent. Yet the echoes continue to resonate through the corridors of memory and imagination. The Golden Palace has long since crumbled into dust, its artificial lake filled and built over, its gardens returned to wilderness or transformed into new purposes. The actors who once performed for his applause have been dead for 2 millennia, their names forgotten along with the plays they brought to life. The musicians who accompanied his songs have taken their melodies with them into whatever realm awaits beyond the final curtain. yet something persists. Not the man himself, for he ended as all mortals must, with a blade at his throat and darkness closing around his fading vision, but the questions he embodied, the contradictions he represented, the possibilities he both reached for and destroyed. In every leader who struggles to balance personal vision with public responsibility, in every artist who seeks patronage from power while maintaining creative integrity, in every human being who discovers that achievement and satisfaction are not synonymous, something of Nero's story continues to unfold. The hills outside Rome, where he drew his final breath, remain much as they were in his time, covered with olive, trees that bear fruit each autumn, regardless of the human dramas that play out beneath their branches. The soil that received his blood has nourished countless generations of plants, transforming the substance of mortality into new life, with the patient alchemy of time. If his ashes were scattered there, they have long since become part of the earth that feeds the roots of trees, whose leaves whisper secrets in languages older than empire. The Roman roads he travelled still carry traffic, though the destinations have changed and the vehicles bear little resemblance to the imperial litters that once transported him in state. The Mediterranean that reflected his ships still catches sunlight and bears commerce between the shores his empire once united under single rule. The stars that look down on his performances continue their ancient dance, indifferent to the rise and fall of terrestrial kingdoms, marking time on a scale that makes human ambition seem as brief as a lightning flash. In the great spiral of history, his reign occupies its designated place, neither as significant as he believed it would be during his lifetime, nor as insignificant as his enemies proclaimed after his death. He was one moment in the long story of human attempt to create order from chaos, meaning from randomness, beauty from the raw materials of existence. His failure was spectacular, but so too was his ambition. His cruelty was documented, but so, too, was his genuine love for art and culture. The judgment of history, that court from which there is no appeal, has rendered its verdict countless times, each generation finding new aspects of his story to condemn or occasionally to understand. Yet the final judgment belongs not to historians or philosophers, not to moralists or apologists, but to time itself. That most patient of judges, which dissolves all human constructions back into their constituent elements, while preserving certain essential patterns that repeat across cultures and centuries. In that longest perspective, Nero becomes not a unique monster or tragic hero, but a representative figure in humanity's ongoing struggle with power, creativity, responsibility, and mortality. His story joins the vast library of human experience that each generation inherits and must learn to read for itself, finding in ancient tales the wisdom or warning needed for contemporary challenges. The specific circumstances of his time have vanished, but the fundamental human dynamics he embodied remain eternally relevant. And so the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian dynasty takes his place in that shadowland where historical figures become archetypes, where individual biography transforms into collective wisdom, where the particular details of one life dissolve into the universal patterns of human experience. His name will continue to be spoken as long as people tell stories about power and its consequences, about the relationship between beauty and authority, about the price of absolute rule in a world where even emperors must face the democracy of death. The wind that blows across the Roman hills carries no memory of his voice, no echo of the songs he believed would make him immortal. Yet in that silence, something profound resides. The recognition that all human achievement, no matter how grand or terrible, eventually returns to the same fundamental quiet from which it emerged. His palaces have fallen, his enemies have forgotten their grievances, his supporters have transferred their loyalty to other causes. Only the questions remain, eternal and unanswered, waiting for each new generation to discover them afresh. In the end, perhaps this is the truest monument to his memory. Not the buildings he constructed or the reforms he attempted, not the songs he sang or the games he sponsored, but the enduring human fascination with the mystery of how power transforms those who wield it, how creativity survives in the midst of destruction, how individual dreams collide with historical necessity. These questions will outlast any marble inscription, any bronze statue, any written account of his deeds. They are carved not in stone, but in the human heart, where they will continue to echo as long as mortals reach for immortality and discover instead their own magnificent, tragic humanity. The silence that follows thunder is not empty, but pregnant with possibilities. In that silence, new stories begin, new dreams take shape, new emperors prepare to face the same eternal challenges that destroyed those who came before. The wheel turns, the seasons change, the eternal human drama continues. And somewhere in that continuing story, the boy who became emperor, the emperor who dreamed of being an artist, the artist who died holding a blade, finds his place in the great symphony of human experience, not as a solo voice, but as one note in a composition too vast and complex for any single mind to comprehend. What an artist perishes in each of us every day, in small deaths and large uns, in dreams deferred and possibilities abandoned. What an emperor dies in every moment when we choose safety over greatness, convention over innovation, the approval of others over the integrity of our own vision. The story of Nero is not just the story of one man's rise and fall, but the story of every human soul that has ever reached for something beyond the ordinary and discovered that such reaching, however it ends, is what makes us most fully alive. Beneath layers of time, only silence remains, yet silence remembers. The wind remembers his last song, though no ear now living has heard it. The stones remember the touch of hands that shaped them into beauty, though those hands have long since returned to dust. The very atoms of his being have become part of other stories, other dreams, other attempts to impose meaning on the vast indifference of the universe. In this way, perhaps, all emperors achieve a kind of immortality, not as individuals, but as part of the endless human story of aspiration and failure, creativity and destruction, love and loss. The last note has sounded, the final curtain has fallen, the stage stands empty in the moonlight, yet somewhere, in some theatre of memory, the performance continues, as it always has and always will, a world without end. Thank you for joining this journey through the shadows of history. If these timeless stories moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to Fall Asleep to History. Let ancient wisdom find new hearts in our modern world, and help these forgotten voices whisper their truths to future generations who hunger for the lessons that only time can teach.